Hi, this is Emily Holloway, and you're listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. This week, I'm speaking with Gregg Colburn, the co-author with Rebecca Walter of Affordable Housing in the United States, published earlier this year by Routledge. Affordable housing in the United States is a little different from the monographs that we usually cover on the show. It's a well-researched and thoughtfully composed primer on affordable housing policy written primarily for students and planning professionals and practitioners.
My name is Gregg Colburn. I am at the University of Washington. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Real Estate in the College of Built Environments, and I study housing and homelessness.
Gregg, thank you for taking some time to talk to us a little bit about this book. Maybe to get started, could you tell us how this project got started? How did you and Rebecca get involved, and who are you writing this for?
The impetus was actually an inbound call from the publisher who was actually looking for someone to write a book on affordable housing. And so there were a couple different avenues that we were pursuing and debating with the publisher, and we had kind of two different ideas. And finally, we kind of settled on the idea that we probably just need an affordable housing 101 book. That there were a lot of great housing policy books, broadly defined, that were very policy focused, but we wanted to kind of bring in everything in this book, not just policy, but also just what does it mean to have affordable housing or not have affordable housing, the consequences of that, et cetera. So that was it was kind of a bumpy process actually to finally get to the point where we're like, okay, this is actually the book we're going to write, and finally got it done. Yeah, I mean, our idea is that certainly could be used in the classroom, but also that it could serve as a resource for advocates or elected leaders who are, now on a city council tasked with dealing with affordable housing, don't know where to start. And this would be kind of a 101 introduction into the topic. So we certainly wrote it with that audience in mind as well.
Great. So then moving into how the book is organized, and you make a distinction that this is focused on affordable housing rather than just housing writ large. So how was the book structured, and really, how did you make some of those decisions about what to keep in, what to leave out?
So, we start with what is affordable housing, and this was, I would argue, probably, from my perspective, one of the more important chapters, which is really defining what it means. And, Rebecca and I made the decision that affordable housing is not, at least in this book, not synonymous with subsidized housing. And a lot of people have made that claim. I happen to disagree with that because there's plenty of subsidized housing that isn't affordable to certain households, and then there's plenty of non-subsidized housing that is affordable for people. Like, as we mentioned in the first couple of pages, for Bill Gates, all housing is affordable. And so, affordability is a function of the cost of housing and the resources that households have to devote to that expense. And so we kind of talk about that and historic patterns in the United States of declining housing affordability, which some other research has really focused heavily on. And so that's kind of where we go. And then in the second part, it's really diving into what does that mean, looking at the housing stock, deconstructing affordability and looking at trends in income and housing costs over time, which is really the story here when you look at this over the last 50 years, which is incomes have stagnated, especially among renters, and housing costs and rents have really, really increased, which has created this affordable housing crisis that we're dealing with. And then we kind of go back in history, which is kind of housing policy, which other books have done as well, and kind of looking at how do we get where we are? Why do we have the system that we have? Why do we have the system that really benefits homeowners and frankly doesn't give a whole lot to renters, especially low-income renters? We talk about the challenges of race and affordable housing and the obvious discrepancies by race and disparities by race, not only in terms of housing access, but wealth accumulation, et cetera, and then segregation. And then kind of conclude that chapter or that section with housing instability, which is something that I think a lot about in terms of precarity, homelessness, eviction, foreclosure, et cetera. And then the third section, we just talk about how do we provide access to affordable housing, and that's looking at who are all the actors involved, and that's not just the government, it's developers and it's financiers and it's planners and all that kind of stuff, nonprofit, for-profit developers, et cetera. And then we go into kind of the basics of affordable housing policy, supply side assistance, which would be public housing and LIHTC, tax credits. We've got demand side assistance. We talk about affordable home ownership plans, and then all the regulatory levers that policies can, or that governments can pull or not pull, as the case may be. And then we conclude with 3 case studies, Chicago, San Antonio, and Seattle. And we picked 3 very, very different cities that we each had some familiarity with, just to show how federal policies interact with local action very differently in different contexts. What's really interesting in those chapters is seeing, because of the way the formulas were established at HUD, Chicago actually gets more per capita goodies from the federal government than Seattle does, even though Seattle's housing crisis is at a far greater level than Chicago's. And so what you see is kind of the Rust Belt and industrial Midwest and Northeast does, those cities do fairly well in terms of allocation of HUD resources, whereas newer Western cities don't get quite as much. And then our final chapter, which is a little bit ironic given what's transpired over the last about 5 months, but was this kind of road path idea. And we kind of look at what could affordable housing look like in the United States under different states, in terms of status quo to kind of incremental change to kind of more substantive or transformative change in policy making. And the idea being, my frustration with a lot of policy books, not just housing generally, is that a lot of people will write these great books and then basically say, like, this is what we should do. But the likelihood of that happening is like 0.0001. And so it's kind of like, well, does this help me? And so what we wanted to do is say, like, well, let's just say that the politics of the United States doesn't change radically. What could we do in this kind of current state of kind of butting heads politically? We're not powerless. States and localities can do some things. The federal government could do some things where there is alignment. And then if we start to move along a little bit, we could make more transformative changes. Now, what we didn't do is write kind of kind of the negative, which is status quo, where with a government looking to dismantle housing policy, which is, at least in the president's budget, what we're looking at right now. And so we look a little foolish in the sense that we assume that status quo is kind of the baseline, and potentially we're going to go backwards from that, which I'm, putting my cards on the table right now would be really, really damaging from my perspective. And so I'm hopeful that the budget that passes Congress will not have some of those elements in it.
Well, you talked a little bit about how you made the case study selections here: Chicago, Seattle, and San Antonio. So if you were to do this again, would you want to look at other cases for comparison? What are other examples of these kind of paradigmatic cities when we're thinking about affordable housing?
Yeah, and I don't know that these are necessarily exemplary other than they're different. And so, Chicago's kind of big city, static Midwestern city, Seattle high growth, and then San Antonio is emblematic of kind of a Sunbelt boom. Not quite Austin-like, but still pretty robust growth in San Antonio. In my travels, what I have found really interesting in other cities that I would like to highlight for folks are, I've been in the Midwest, but not Chicago, smaller places. I've been in Green Bay, Wisconsin, Indianapolis, was just in Missouri 2 weeks ago. And what I'm seeing in the Midwest is really tightening housing markets. Rental vacancies below 5%, rents going up, and these cities saying, what is going on here? That to me is super interesting, and that's a case that I would want to highlight. My suspicion, and this is true all around the place, is we're seeing a lot more single-person households, a lot more single-person renting, which means that you can have flat population growth but declining vacancy rate because each household's consuming more housing on a per capita basis. And I first saw this in Albuquerque when I was doing some work down there. I was like, why are the vacancy rates down? They haven't grown in 10 years. And it's because they've actually created a lot of new households. They're just single person households. So it creates all these questions around, one, affordability, because you don't have vacancy, and then two, what kind of housing stock do you need if people are wanting to live alone? People are certainly partnering later in life, romantically speaking. And I think the roommate dynamic, I always had roommates until I was married. That just seems less prevalent now among the 20 somethings. And so, that's an interesting question. So one, I would want to think about those types of cities. I think there's another class of cities that I've visited that's really interesting to me, which is kind of what I'm calling the hospitality-driven cities in the United States. So Sun Valley, Idaho, Bend, Oregon, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Asheville, North Carolina. The similarities across these cities is pretty remarkable. San Luis Obispo, I was just there a couple of weeks ago. And these are places that are now destinations, many times for retirees. People are going there for the lifestyle, and these cities are blowing up. and the affordability crisis is profound. It has huge impacts for service workers. It's, more homelessness. And so I think that's a class of cities that I don't know that the nation is really realizing what's going on there. And so that would be another one that I'd be super interested in. And then what would be a third? So one Midwestern, one of those boom ones, and probably the Sun Belt again. I think the Sun Belt is just Charlotte, North Carolina, probably grown pretty fast. They've built a ton of housing. They've actually accommodated growth fairly well. So I think that's a story that's pretty interesting.
So you just mentioned Charlotte's housing production boom. Is that the key to maintaining affordability? Or are there other public policies integrated into it that help support and maintain affordability?
One of the points is that there are places that have built a whole bunch of housing and therefore have avoided a housing crisis. So it's not a housing program per se in the sense that it's public policy, but it's basically they've created conditions where they can build a whole bunch of housing and therefore you can accommodate growth. And so that's kind of a lot of cities in the Sun Belt are in that camp. And now I wanna caveat that with a lot of times that housing was built in a way that we in Seattle and many people on the coast might not find that attractive, which is through limited regulation and sprawl. And so, it's a double-edged sword in the sense that it does demonstrate that building the units matters in the sense that you can help accommodate growth and maintain a rental market that's more reasonable. That's the story of the Sun Belt in the 2010s. Boomed, and they built a bunch of housing. And the story of the coast is they boomed and they didn't build much housing. And what happened? Rents just went bananas. And so in no jurisdiction are the affordability policies sufficiently robust to deal with the scale that we're talking about. And so we're kind of nibbling around the edges in each of those places. And so I want effective nibbling. Like I want those programs to be as productive as possible. But ultimately, we also need to make sure as jurisdictions that we are pairing job growth with housing growth. And if we don't, these programs are just going to be chasing higher and higher rents, and it just becomes really, really challenging. And so I think for folks that are not interested in sprawl, who are not interested in really, really limited regulatory environments, we then need to have a real adult conversation around, well, then what does that mean then to substantially increase the production of housing in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and Los Angeles in ways that are demonstrate good environmental stewardship, and creating the density that doesn't force people to drive for 2 hours to their job. And that's, I think, where we're wrestling a little bit with, especially on the West Coast. And that's why there's a whole bunch of, this whole abundance conversation is kind of centering around that as well. And, we've got people who like that, hate that, but that's a good conversation to have right now. There are other places that have done it. And if you don't like how they did it, that's fine. But then we should probably figure out how to do that as well, as opposed to just saying we're going to sit on our hands, because the consequences of that have been dire, on our coast. If you just look at affordability and homelessness and all those problems.
Right. So there are some really important ingredients that go into a healthy, sustainable housing policy framework beyond supply, beyond land use regulations. Can you talk about some of the other important factors? What are the biggest challenges in these local communities?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is just the local political opposition to multifamily housing and denser housing, which is true in every single city in the United States. And the same story plays out over and over and over again, which is you start to change people's neighborhoods and they get upset and they show up at Tuesday night and pretty soon you don't have new housing. And so that at its root is central to these challenges. And that's why this is hard, because one stroke of the pen doesn't do it. It's happening every Tuesday night. And so that civic engagement becomes really important. I think the way we even envision civic engagement needs to change, because in the name of kind of democratic representation, we've invited people who are impacted by new housing development to meetings, to planning commission meetings. And then they show up and 5 people show up and they're over 50 and they're white and they're single family homeowners and they got nothing else to do. And they say no. And then the planning commission or the city council says, well, I'm representing my constituents. 5 of them showed up and said no, 0 showed up and said yes. So I have to say no. And then we end up in this. And so when you think about like the challenges to scaling, I mean, our region, Puget Sound region, needs 880,000 housing units over the next 20 or 25 years, according to our local planning organization. That's a lot of housing. And so when we're literally fighting over a 50 or 200 unit development, And that goes back and forth and back and forth, and someone sues, and then we do this, and it takes 5 years. It's like, we have to get to 880,000. Like, we're not going to get there kind of playing small ball, like each Tuesday night, fighting about every single development. And so to me, like, rethinking that system becomes super, super important. And it's obviously easier said than done, but we need to be thinking at scale, in my opinion. And the problem is we haven't. We've just been thinking project to project. And so, I'm not an anti-regulation person. I always say in my talks on my first book, I joke, like, I'm for regulation in society. I want my ground beef to be safe. And everyone kind of laughs. And we're like, well, yeah, of course we want our ground beef to be safe. And we want people to live in housing that's not going to fall down on them, or it's going to, we don't want asbestos and all this kind of stuff. But taking 7 years to build housing in San Francisco right now, when people are dying in the streets, that doesn't seem unreasonable to me to say, like, well, maybe we should rethink that a little bit. There has to be some reasonable middle ground where we can be good stewards of the environment, provide appropriate processes to ensure that housing is quality, but also we got to get the housing built. And that's where we've really fallen down. And I think that's where a lot of elected leaders on our coast need to look in the mirror a little bit. And frankly, the other people who need to look in the mirror are the folks who are showing up at Tuesday night and saying, we don't want this housing, because that coalition of folks has absolutely contributed to our affordability crisis in the cities where we desperately, desperately need housing. And so then you get into land use changes and parking minimums and all these things that have been demonstrated to have a real impact. It's not immediate, it's not a light switch, but when you get that full package of changes, you over time you're going to see more housing production. In the interim, there'll still be a lot of pressure on these policies to support low income folks, because rents aren't going down in Seattle anytime soon, even if we get rid of single family.
So we're recording this in May 2025, so it's unclear what the world is going to look like by the time this airs, but have you already started to observe how staffing cuts at HUD or the pending federal budget, just the overall capacity of affordable housing advocates, has been changing since January?
Yeah, I mean, I travel around the country a lot, and so I certainly hear what local jurisdictions are dealing with right now. And it's kind of concerning. On the homelessness side, there's definitely been, the federal government's been a little slow to release money that's already been appropriated to states and localities. And there's, kind of been this kind of give and take of, will you abide by our new rules that we've established through executive order, and some jurisdictions saying, well, we don't really agree with those executive orders and they're inconsistent with our business practices. And so there's litigation going on there. There's obviously the proposed budget cuts that we discussed a moment ago in terms of what HUD might look like, what that could mean for voucher capacity and the number of vouchers in the system. And then I just think there's the capacity of HUD to do what it wants to do with less headcount, and I think that's going to be tough to see in weeks and months, but I think that plays out over time, where just the capacity of the organization to do what it needs to do to help a lot of people who need housing may be constrained, and that's something I'm certainly watching and concerned about over the next couple of years.
And again, this is being recorded in May, so this is another moving target. But how do you see tariffs impacting affordable housing production? Is it already visible?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of had casual conversations on this, so this is not necessarily an empirical, this is more of an anecdotal thing. But yeah, I think people are really concerned. From what I understand, and I'm not a builder, just to be clear, but I think the Canadian lumber was exempted in the last round, which was a win for the home. I think the home builder lobby was pretty aggressive with the administration on that, saying we get a lot of our lumber from Canada, and if you put a big tariff on that, like, our houses are going to cost a lot more. And yes, we do have American lumber, but right now that's our source, and so we can't just grow trees in the next 2 weeks. So that was one that I was kind of following, just because we're so close to the Canadian border here, and and there's a lot of Canadian lumber up here. But yeah, I think there's a huge level of uncertainty, and I think the other part is just what's going to happen with interest rates. And certainly we saw on Friday with S&P downgrading the credit rating of the U.S. government and our debt. What happened to the 10-year Treasury yesterday as it went up, and I noticed this morning it's up again today, and so that translates into higher mortgage costs, and that's going to hurt home buyers, but it's also going to hurt people who need to raise financing to build housing. And so when you get this double whammy of higher costs and higher financing costs, it's just harder to build, and housing that you are going to build is more expensive. And then when you couple that with a federal policy regime that's looking to pull back in terms of supports, whether it's rental assistance or subsidies, it's a pretty problematic path that we're looking at, and somewhat alarming. So my hope is that some of the more dramatic changes don't prevail, because there could be a perfect storm that looks pretty ugly here, and I hope that cooler heads prevail and that we don't end up down that path. Now, even if we get rid of that stuff, as we highlight in the book, like, we're still in a situation where all of this is inadequate. So to end this interview on a really high note, it's tricky. It's absolutely tricky. I think the other point on the tariff side of things is also just labor supply. There's a huge concern that there are a lot of folks who are building homes right now who may or may not be documented, and if we end up losing that labor supply in agriculture and home building, et cetera, that could have big impacts as well. And so there are a lot of forces right now that are, I think, complicating the production of housing.
My thanks to Gregg Colburn, co-author with Rebecca Walter of Affordable Housing in the United States from Routledge. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. You've been listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. Special thanks to Drexel University and the editors at UAR. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. This show was mixed and produced by Aidan McLaughlin and written and produced by me, Emily Holloway. You can find us on Blue Sky at urbanaffairsreview.bluesky.social for updates on the journal and the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.